Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Commercial Risk's second conference of this year, Captives 2021, Now is the Time for Action. Companies across the world are increasingly turning to captive solutions to replace their traditional insurance programs. Evidence shows that insurance buyers across Europe are becoming frustrated with rising premiums and slower claim service from the traditional market. In the next 3 days, we will be exploring these issues and providing plenty of experts to guide risk and insurance managers through the captive world. My name is Liz Booth and I work with Commercial Risk. I will be your moderator for the next 3 days. Before we start, I need to thank our sponsors, AIG, Generali, Zurich, McGill & Partners, and Swiss Re Corporate Solutions for enabling this event to happen, and to thank our many risk manager experts joining the sessions for the next 3 days, as well as the Institute of Risk Management for its support. This is an interactive conference and we want your input throughout. We would like to encourage you to ask questions via the chat function that you will see on the right of your screen. And also we'll be asking you to respond to poll questions. The tab for that is beside the chat tab, also on the right of your screen. Now I will hand to Audrey van der Vaart, Director Global Insurance Arcadius and President of NARIM, who will introduce us to the topic and the next 3 days of conversation. Audrey, over to you.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you everyone who is on this conference, joining a team which is in discussion full of us. When I raised this discussion last October, November, and January again, we thought about, yes, now it's time for action. But the main question is, why and why now? And that's my introduction for today. Fiona, start my slides, please. When you're talking about why and why now, we have to go back in history. Because captive is one, but it's all started about insurance. And insurance really started in the 1600s. Maybe already in the 200s and 400s were some parts of insurance, but the main insurance started in 1600s. Next slide, Fiona. Because then time we were sailing across the world, from the Netherlands, from London, from everywhere. And the risk was those ships sometimes didn't return. That we need some savings for building new ships after a disaster. That's why we put some money in a box for savings for future losses. And the all is, as we introduced our insurance, or in Amsterdam, or in Rotterdam, or in London, typically areas where we are at harbors, we created such a line as mutual insurance, joining together our boxes. Next slide. Starting by mutuals, that's fine. But when you start musicals, there were commercial initiatives that, hey, then we can do it too. Because when we can earn money by making insurance, we have a goal, an aim to have profits. That's fine for insurance, and that's needed for insurance. But when you have too much profits, then we as risk managers are looking for alternatives. Be reasonable. When we're paying a lot of money to insurance, we think by ourselves, hey, and I can pay so much money, maybe I can do it myself and just raise a captive. Not an insurance for yourself, but a captive. Might be an option. But if raising a captive, we have to go back to school. But captive is not the only issue. When we are talking about captive, we are talking about risk. We have need to understand our risk. And when we need to understand our risk, then we're thinking about, hey, we need to avoid risk, which we can't have in our business, because risk is the killing our issue for a business. And if we can't, if we avoid risk, then we have to start to reduce risk for the limits we can accept. And those insurance we can't accept, we go to risk transfer. And then we use the captive. So you can't have too much losses in your captive, you can't have too much risk transfer, but your captive is not large enough for that. So this is the main issue. When you start up with captive, you have to change your mindset, not just buying insurance, but manage your risk. And that gives you the issue about why are we doing this? Yes, now we have a captive. So what are we doing in the captive? And where do we have a captive? In London? Bermuda? Guernsey? Malta? Luxembourg? You can choose everywhere. And how much money store we in a captive? Additional savings for some habitats? For shareholder savings? Or potential tax savings? Mainly going into tax avoidance? All these questions are wrong questions. It's not about this. It's not about extra additional savings. It's about manage your risk. We'll talk about it in the next few days. What are we doing? Not the wrong thing, but the correct things. That was about why. And now about why now. When we look back to the last 10, 15 years, we have seen a very, very soft market. Low interest rates, more players, insurers or new insurers on the scene. So a lot of capital was available and premiums went down. Easy going, easy renewals, large extended terms and conditions, no problems at all to renew insurance and go in. Your need for captives was maybe less, only where you're looking for a captive for yourself. Next slide. But then 2019 appears. And the first insurer said, I can't do it again. I need to increase my premium. And when the first insurer crossed the line, the next will be to follow. And so every insurers are changing their mindset and premium went up, conditions and clauses in discussion. But after 2019, 2020 appears and COVID was there. And that what is happening was a double, 3 double, 10 double hardening market. Premiums went up very high, retentions even more, and conclusions come in, and terms went down. And that's the situation we are now. This slide I use from ERMIC. Thank you, ERMIC. In the survey what they did about their risk managers, see what their problems were and the issues were during their renewal in that end of the year 2020. And what you see, most of them said, again, we have to start earlier. We need more data. But most important is the bottom line. Almost 2/3 of the risk managers are looking for, we need to look for alternatives like captives. And that's not only in question mark in the UK, it was also in the Netherlands, in France, Germany, Asia, across the world. This is what we are talking about and thinking about. And that's the question, why now? This is why now. So, final slide. Now is the time for action. We need to do something. We have to look for alternatives. And what are those alternatives? Main question, what about captives? Let's just talk about it. But be aware, it is not about insurance only. It's mainly also about risk. And with that, I give back to Liz.
Thank you very much, Audrey. A very good introduction to the topic and to why we need 3 days of discussion for this. Before I introduce the other speakers for this session, Seizing the Moment, we're actually going to ask our first poll question. So to find the poll, simply look to the right of your screen and you will see the chat box open. Beside that, you will see a tab which says poll. So if you could all please click on that, and then we're going to ask 3 quick poll questions. They're all yes/no answers. The first one of these is, are you considering alternatives to traditional insurance? Yes or no? So if you wouldn't mind, hopefully you're all finding that tab. If you click on that tab, and then you should see the question, and if you could vote yes or no. I'll give you a moment to do that and to find that. And then hopefully we can move on also to our second poll question, which is, has COVID in any way changed organizations' approach to risk management? So have you seen more demand for risk management services in the last year? And again, the answer to that is yes or no. So if you could please just tick your answer there. And again, we can give that a moment before we move on to our final question of this session of 3. And that is, has COVID-19 proved a boost for risk management? Is it higher on the agenda than ever before? Are you, as a risk or insurance manager, spending more time perhaps visiting your boardroom and chatting to board members? And again, the answer to that is either a yes or a no. So if you could please tick those boxes, that would be fantastic. We will have the results of those polls later on in this session. So hopefully you've managed to do that. And we can now move on to our discussion. And to do that, as well as Audrey, we also have James Bohan, Head of Global Fronting and Multinational Ireland for AIG, and Carl Lehman, Vice President of Belrim and Chief Risk Officer at Cato and Nati, and also who received a Lifetime Achievement Award at the FIRMA European Risk Management Awards last December. So welcome to the three of you. We're going to have a very broad question to start our discussion, but it's really why set up a captive in the first place? And Audrey, after your introduction, would you like to kind of continue that conversation before we ask the others?
Yeah, happy to do that. Why do we start a captive in the first place? Now, mainly there are two reasons. The first was in my introduction already, where you are large enough and pay so much insurance to the insurance world that you think about, hey, can I do it more smarter, simpler, easier, cheaper? And then you start thinking about a captive, raising a captive. Maybe in history, large companies have done raising a captive by that reason. Other reason is today is, hey, we are seeing more issues in renewal. We need some more power for ourselves and more resistance to the insurance world. And then we are more in defense role, raising a captive. Carl, I think you are on the same line of that, right?
Yes, and also from my side, good morning to everybody. Yes, I think the main issue now is that a captive could bring stability, to say so, or a bit more stability in your insurance portfolio. What we saw with the last renewals was that actually a lot of insurance buyer had a choice whether to exceed the insurance budget they had or to accept lower or less coverage if they wanted to meet their budget. So that was a bit weird for a lot of us. So there, a captive could bring a bit more stability. And another reason is to take out the fluctuations in rate out of your budget, because we all know that most of the companies have budgets. So it's not funny if you have to go back to the accountant and say, hey, the budget I gave you last year, can you please double it with 100%, because that is what the situation in the market is now today. So that's something we don't like, and that's one of the reasons why you could have a captive. So another thing is to take care of the exclusions or the things that the insurers don't want or don't want to cover anymore. I mean, not longer than this weekend, we saw that AXA XL is announcing that they will no longer reimburse ransomware payments in new policies that they subscribe. So if you have that coverage in place, or if you're just thinking about getting that coverage, it's not funny to see that all of a sudden the insurers are changing their strategy on what they will cover and what they will not cover anymore. Another thing is to take on board coverages that are very difficult to get in the market. And we've in some working groups we are really working on that one, and that is the contingent non-damage business interruption, CBI. That's a very useful coverage for a lot of companies with what we've seen with the pandemic, with the Suez Canal issue on supply chain. So contingent non-business damage interruption, and that's not easy to get. I mean, not all insurers are willing to give you that coverage. So that's also something you get partially or completely, depending on the volume you need, cover in your captive. So the conclusion could be that you need to have an even more tailor-made coverage adapted to the needs of your company. And you will also, as Audrey already mentioned, have a better grip on the claim handling, which is also important. And last but not least, and that's something we haven't talked about it most of the European captive. It's more of an issue of more of a subject in the US market. That is to make a return on the money that you have in your reserves. Certainly today, I admit it's not an easy one. Actually, you have three choices, theoretically speaking. You leave the money on the account of your reserves, but with the negative interest rates, that's maybe not the best option to do these days. You can leave the cash. You can hand it over, as it happens in a lot of company, to the headquarters, where your treasury department will take over the management of your reserves, or you could hire an asset manager who helps you to make or to try to make more money about your reserves. And that could also be one of the reasons to convince your board to have a captive, because the reasons we already mentioned are also there to convince your board to step into the captive, but to make money out of the reserves that you have could also be a reason for your board. Now, having said this, you don't set up a captive as a short-term solution. If you set it up today, it's not to bring solutions for 1 or 2 years. It's a long-term thing. It's there to stay. If you are looking for, I think, more short-term solutions, then you could eventually turn to PCCs and stuff like that, but that will be handled later on in the other sessions. So that's my main things I would say about why set up the captive and how to sell it to your board. James?
Yeah, thank you very much, Carl. That's the difficulty of going third. All the good points are taken. I suppose to summarize, the point I would say is the captive can be a solution to a problem. If a company has a particular problem, the captive can provide that solution. And I suppose in summary, it's an opportunity to reduce the cost of risk for the company. And also it can assist the organization to reduce the volatility and create capacity. So I suppose in summary, those are the two things that the captive can do. You often find that companies feel that they're not getting the benefit of the doubt or the true nature of their good loss history when they're going to the conventional market. So that the captive can do that and can pick up those particular types of risks. So I suppose in summary, it's really what the captive can bring to solve problems for a company, especially when it comes to their insurance and risk needs. So I'll hand back to you, Liz.
Thank you very much indeed, James. Just to let you know that the poll results are coming in. I understand that a few people have had some problems getting onto the polls. If you have, you just need to press the refresh browser and then it will give you the polls that are up there. In the meantime, we have had some results, James, which will be of interest to you before I ask you the next question. One of them is are you considering alternatives to traditional insurance? And about 8 times the number are saying yes compared to those who are saying no. Whilst in terms of whether COVID's changed the organisation's view, we've got 80% saying yes and just 20% saying no. And in terms of is it a boost for risk manager, it's 82% saying yes and 17% saying no. So obviously, the results perhaps much as you would expect given our conversation. James, I think we want to start diving a little bit into the sort of nitty-gritty of how do you do these things. So one of the first questions that people will be asking themselves is it easier to establish a reinsurance captive? Is that what you want to be doing?
In theory, it should, but I suppose this, like the first question, is why set up a captive in the first place? It'll be driven by that particular reason. A reinsurance captive, in theory, should be easier to set up if you've got a fronter on board, because that will take away a lot of the issues that you'll have with regard to claims handling, policy issuance, especially for lines that would be difficult to issue, or you need admitted cover in particular countries, or there might be compulsory lines, or you might need to have local evidence of cover. So from that point of view, yes, the reinsurance captive should be easier to set up. However, it may not be the most appropriate, because you might find that the kind of cover that you're looking for may not be something that would be in the traditional markets, and it might be very exclusive to the organization that you have. So really, from the point of view of insurance or reinsurance. It really comes down to, as I said in the first question, the problem you're trying to solve and the solution that you're looking for from that point of view. So again, I love to say it was, yes, it's always go to reinsurance captive, but again, it really comes down to what are you trying to do? What is the motivation of the company involved from that point of view?
Okay. And so then conversely, setting up a direct writing captive, is it harder and to operate it? I mean, is it, and you know, obviously we've touched on the which type of captive should it be? How do you make the decision?
Again, it comes back to what you're trying to achieve. With regard to an insurance captive, if you have the ability to write that particular risk and you feel comfortable with that risk, that's something you can do from that point of view. If you can feel that you can put a policy together, you can set up the claims infrastructure, and that you can basically have all of that in place with actuarial to basically run an insurance company, that's perfectly fine. And I think it's a really good thing to do, especially if the risk involved is particularly difficult to place or very unique. As has been said, you know, supply chain and things like that might be something you might want to put through an insurance captive, or maybe something that you've got a distress line that you're having difficulty getting traditional cover on the whole thing, or the terms and conditions are very difficult, or maybe it's a new and emerging line. So really, from the point of view of how you go about it, it'll come down to probably a question of the feasibility study, which is probably a very, very important part of what you're trying to do with regard to formation of your captive. And what you find with the feasibility study, that's going to answer those questions about what is the best way to go. It will give you the quantitative and the qualitative answers that you need in order to make that decision.
Audrey, perhaps we can ask you then, what does a captive feasibility study entail?
It's line what James is saying. When you're starting just thinking about captive, it's not just going to the shop and buying a captive and start doing business. You have to dig in your files, dig in your business to look at your pretensions, your questions, your problems, or your things you want to solve. You have to find out what the best option might be for you. And going back to your business, what is your risk profile? For instance, when you look at traditional art for a simpler captive for repeating small losses, it's easy to have a captive. Have you captive in, for instance, Europe, with for freedom of service around those countries, it's very easy to have a direct captive to manage by yourself. As soon as you are facing for captive for special emerging risks, and not for in Europe, but for a global perspective, with so many countries with different position of licenses and non-admitted insurance, then you have far more issues to manage. And then you have to look at the question mark, do you have to go to a direct captive or to a PCC or to a reinsurance captive? All those items are a part of the feasibility story. How strong you are, what your risks are, how large it should be, how it should be organized, and but potentially will be the pricing of that already cost and pricing in premium wise. All those elements come along, and you need that study to go back to your board and to say to your board, hey, this is the best solution for us. Let's go for it. And if you go to your board and you don't have tools in your hands with strong arguments to say why you want to do it, and what the risks are and what the potentials are, or you get questions back from, hey, have you think about this? Have you think about that? And you are pushed back in the corner to have to ask and look for the right answers. If you have those answers by feasibility study, you can move forward. If you don't have those answers, you are gone at your board.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, that plays in very nicely. We've got a question that's come through from the audience, and please, can I encourage you to ask questions? Use the chat function on the main page. You'll see that to the right-hand side. But somebody's found it and asked, how big a commitment is a captive in terms of management time? So, Carl, is that something that you would like to address?
Yes, but first of all, I mean, I just wanted to add on the previous ones, we should also not forget one of the big advantages. I mean, honestly speaking, if you start up from scratch, I think it's easier if you go by a reinsurance captive. One of the things is the arm's length premiums that will be decided by the fronting, so you will not have to have too much concerns about the being arm's length, because that's one of the questions that is asked by the authorities, if the premium that you're charging is in line with the market. So the arm's length issue partially goes away if you work with the fronting. And also you should not forget that you need different licenses to be able to operate a direct captive. If you want to have HR stuff in the US, you have to be admitted locally. So the license issue is also a bit more complicated if you have a direct captive than a reinsurance captive. On the study, you will have to see and make maybe a difficult choice. Who will make that study? Because you could go to the big five who also do those studies, the Ernst & Youngs of this world, or you could go to a broker. So both have the possibility to do those studies, but the outcome could maybe be different. So that's something you also would have a look at. Now, coming back to that question from the audience on the volume of a captive, or the long term, I think. Can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, so it was, how big a commitment is a captive in terms of management time? Yeah, does it take a lot of your time?
Well, it depends. Maybe it's not the answer, but it depends how much time you can spend on it, and what is the role of your captive manager you're hiring, or the broker. I think it's very different from one company to another, how much time they spend on the captive. I mean, you have the administrative part. I wouldn't say it's the most exciting one. So I think as a risk manager, and as Audrey correctly mentioned, it's about the risk. So I think for a risk manager, it's more fun, to say so, to spend time on the risk than on the compliance part. Also, you shouldn't forget the compliance part, but I think if you outsource the compliance part, it's more fun to handle, to see, look, those are the risk, what are the claims, etc., etc. And then how much time do you spend on it depends on the size of the captive. And there, do you have one line of business? Do you have 10 lines of business into your captive? That'll depend. And in my situation, we started a captive about 5 years ago, so we build it up slightly, step by step. And that's also the fun part. And in the first, initially, when you start it up, you will spend a lot of time but once it's on its way, it doesn't take too much time. But again, it depends on how you will hire it. Will you have a captive manager taking care of all the feasibility and the compliance issues, or are you dealing yourself with the compliance issues? But then it could easily become a full-time job, I think, easily. If you do everything, if you want to do everything yourself, if you're able to do so, I think it will be easy a full-time job. But I wouldn't advise to do so. I think we should, as Audrey says, look at the fun part of it, look at the risks, and I think you will bring much more added value to your company by looking at the risks than by looking at the compliance side of the captive.
Okay, thank you very much, Carl. So let's turn a little bit to the why now of our conversation. And James, if I could ask you really, what benefits do you see captives offering during a hardening market? You know, what can you gain from that? And can a captive help, particularly with if terms and conditions and exclusions are changing? Is that something where a captive comes to the fore?
Yes, it can, yeah, because hardening markets are characterized by increased premiums and decreased cover. Really, that's what you're looking at here. And you're looking for the captive to kind of fill that gap for you, or to bring a solution from that point of view. So ultimately, it can mean that you can basically, if cover isn't available or if there's higher deductibles, the captive can then fill that particular deductible and become part of the program. Also, it can demonstrate to the market that the company wants to put skin in the game, that they're happy with their risk management profile. They feel that their loss history is better than what the industry has. So really, from that point of view, it gives you a stronger negotiating position when it comes to dealing with the markets on that. So it really is there to really try to take that volatility out of the particular market that you're dealing with. So from that point of view, in a hardening market, it's really that the volatility that the hardening market brings with regard to your insurance premiums and the cover. That's what a captive can do to fill that particular gap. And you can also find that it also allows the company to participate in any profits that it can make, from the point of view if the company has a very, very good loss history, or it feels that it has a stronger performance when it comes to its claims, it can actually participate in any profits it makes there, rather than giving that money to the market from that point of view. So again, it gives a company with a strong risk management profile and good internal controls the opportunity to basically participate in the risk and also take that volatility out of the market, especially in this hardening market.
Thank you. Audrey, we've got a question in from the audience. Please, audience out there, please do keep popping them in. They've asked, if you set up a captive but the losses turn out to be worse than expected in the first year or years, how do you convince the board that it was still a good idea? So if some of what James has just been talking about doesn't actually pan out, what do you do?
Yeah, that's the issue. You have to tell your board at the first stage before you're starting a captive. Hey, you're starting a captive, you have to build up reserves in the captive. So we don't want to have major losses in the first few years. Maybe that's the reason why you can't start a captive at a full scale in the first years. You have built up with small pieces to get aware of your risk, ability to manage your risk, to capture your risk, and build up your reserves. So yes, when you have a wrong first 3 years, you have a different story, and you have still back to go to your study. Why did you do it? And you should be there a good reason. Or you have what already James said, you didn't really study correct about your risk profile, and you think about you're less at risk, but you were more at risk. So that's the wrong issue, your wrong start you were. And in addition to what James said about why do you start a captive, it's bouncing back to the insurance market because you think you are strong enough. Manage your risk, know what you're doing, and potentially when the market said you are at risk, you need more pay premium, and it is really not the case, then you can say, okay, I'll take the first step and I can bounce back the premium and I can bounce back my insurance tower. I can make them strong. But if you are wrong in your exception, and you're wrong in your management, and you're wrong in your risk profile, you have a hard discussion after 3 years. It's just a fact.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. Carl, do you want to add anything to that? And also, I was wondering if you want to also address the question of whether, at what point in terms of premium spend would you consider a captive becoming viable for a company?
So at what point in time does a captive become viable? That's a very general question on a very broad problem, because, I mean, again, it will depend on the size of your company. It will depend on the risks you're looking at. I mean, a storm coverage is not the same as a political risk, to say so. Are you looking at a coverage of 5 million, or are you looking at the coverage of 50 million? So that's all so different. So I think that the first thing is your fixed cost. You will have like your administrative cost and everything around it, and still the ability to pay out claims. I don't think it makes sense to talk about less than 1.5 million of premium a year. I don't think it's useful to start a discussion to set up a captive below that level. But above that, anything can happen, and it's very different on the type of risks that you want to cover. And if you have to start up your captive, I would go, as I said, step by step, and it's important to have a good spread of the risks in different lines, and to not give too much coverage, to limit the coverage, so that of course you will have to be compliant, and that's then the work of the compliance department to see if all the figures that you're gonna have that you will meet all the criteria. So you cannot just give 20 million coverage if you have 1 million premium. So all those things have to be in line. There have to be some thought around it. But as I said, I would certainly not consider starting up a captive below 1.5 million of premium a year. Certainly not. But if you really want to do something, I think, but maybe James can say something about it, the protected cell companies, that might be a solution, maybe a bit more on short term for lower amounts of premium.
Absolutely. James, I will turn that over to you. We do have a session involving some of your AIG colleagues actually later on this morning on protected cell companies. So I know we're going to deep dive, but perhaps you would just like to comment on that briefly. We've got plenty of time.
I'm reluctant to go stealing stealing Bob and Stephen's thunder on that, because I know they're presenting on it later. But yeah, PCCs are a very good solution or a good option to use for a company that feels that it would like to dip its toe into the waters of captives. It means that they can restrict the risk from that point of view. They're not really setting up a company, they're just renting space, if you will, in another company from that point of view. So it actually gives them an opportunity to dip their toe in the water. And you often find that PCCs might stay as PCCs for decades, or they might decide that they'll go to a full-blown captive because they'll have a little bit more control over the ability to pay dividends and things like that. So again, it's one of those, it is another option out there. There's lots of alternative options out there to captives. And I suppose what we want to get from this session, I suppose, is that, this should be thought provoking for risk managers, brokers, and insurers to see, this is a discussion that's worth having with a client who probably hasn't considered taking some kind of participation in their risk, albeit by a captive, or be it basically going with the traditional market. So it really comes down to what the company is trying to achieve. But again, the PCC is a really, really good option from the point of view of a company that wants to put a small amount of risk and keep some participation in themselves. Again, and it should have a short-term kind of a view towards it, because ultimately it's going to be something that they can probably extract themselves fairly easily from, whereby having a captive can be a little bit more involved when you're trying to unwind a captive, or if the captive has served its purpose.
Audrey, would you add to that, or would you just agree with your colleagues?
I fully agree, and I'm really a fan of PCC, as I think the main issues for captive owners today are Solvency II and compliance, which is a headache for yourself when you have to manage by yourself. And using a captive broker and a broker for you manage your captive and a PCC, it takes you a lot of your daily business away and gives you more flexibility just to focus on risk and risk management by itself. So yes, that's the thing I can do. But let's discuss it in a later session more in a broad perspective.
Absolutely. We've got about 20 minutes left of this session, so I'm really hoping the audience is going to ask a few more questions, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions out there. One that has come in is whether a captive is more suited to a company that is centralized rather than a diversified one with local autonomy. So I don't know, Audrey or Carl, which of you would like to kick off on that conversation, but what's your view on that? Is it easier if it's centralized? Audrey, what's your take?
I think it's correct, that assumption. When you are not centralized, organized, you have to sell your captive to the regions. And when you're centralized, organized, you can place your captive in the center and move from there and structure your regions to do so. So I think, yes, to have at the center point all your insurance available and your power about insurance and risk management available, and from there start up your captive, is a more stronger position than you have to do it on a more spread regional authority basis. Sure.
Yes and no. I mean, I work for a very, very decentralized company, and we have a captive. But I mean, what is decentralized? The thing is, what is decentralized, and what are the autonomy that is given for us? We try to combine, and it's important for us as a company to combine the advantages of an SME being client focused. We want our people who are local to focus on the client and to give quick solutions and quick response to clients. But we want to combine it with the strength of a large financial group. And there, some things are centralized, amongst which insurance and the captive, but the operations are very decentralized. So I think I agree with what others said, but I think it is still possible to have a captive in a decentralized environment. Having said that, local guys, and it's clearly said, what are the insurances that are run centralized and the ones that are decentralized. That's also a clear cut. Having no surprises, everybody should know who does what. But if you have clear agreements, you can still have a captive in a decentralized organization. If you have, I mean, by us, decentralized mean that the local guys should working for the operations and for their clients, and not with administrative stuff, not with insurance issues, not with claims, but with making and holding happy clients. So I think, even as I said, in a decentralized organizations with good and clear agreements, you can set up a captive and have a successful captive.
Okay, James, do you from your side of the equation, do you have any view on who's easier to deal with? Is it centralized or diversified?
I agree with Carol. Normally, when we're dealing with large organizations that are looking at or have a captive, you already find that their insurance spend is something that is quite centralized, or they try to keep as centralized as possible, because you often find that when they're decentralized, they probably don't have a lot of insurance expertise in the field. So really, they're heavily reliant on their risk management department or their insurance group to give them assistance from that point of view. And you find with the decentralized as well, one of the things that you probably would find, it's probably a better opportunity to use a fronter sometimes, because you often find a lot of times this decentralized thing, it's easier if they're actually can deal with probably an insurance company on the ground, because then they can basically do things in their own language, and also in person in the same time zone. So, as with captives, there's no right answer to this. It really comes down to what you're trying to achieve. But again, from our point of view, it does work from a decentralized point of view, because as Carol said, normally risk and insurance is one of the things they try to centralize as much as possible, because again, it can make it a little bit more efficient from the point of view of dealing with their risks and getting claims paid in particular.
Okay, we now have some great questions coming in from the audience, which is good to see. Please do keep them coming. Very quickly, back to this question of how you deal with your board. Somebody's asked, what's been the main reservation from the board? And then perhaps we're going to go into a few more questions about choice of jurisdiction and things. But Audrey, Carl, have you actually had reservations from your board? Have you had pushbacks on this?
I have had several reservations when I started the idea of a captive. That was in 2007, and I didn't even have the ability to discuss the board. It was just ignored. No way, we are don't doing that direction. And in 2010 again, I start the option about the captive, and our board said, try to make your study, but don't accept a captive, because it's not our area. We don't want to go there. So it takes me 6 years to be in the background, to be recognize the possibilities and the options for a captive before get the agreement to go in there. Yes, it is not easy to those people in the board who have their focus on other issues than just going to a captive. It's a totally different area from their perspective. Otherwise, you have a CFO who is fund or captives or have seen a captive before in other company. Yes, then you have very easy going. But in a country like me, where the captive was non-issue before, it was a hard way to go that, and not easy going for 1 year.
And what about you, Carl? How was your?
Yes, I think times have changed, and I think as Audrey mentioned, in the time span that he mentioned, that there was the big thing of tax and tax evasion schemes, and I think we should still take that into account. But at a certain point in time, there was like a not so positive view on captives from the external market, and certainly from certain authorities. For them, it was clear, and we've heard that with when we had talks with OECD from FIRMA. Initially, for them, it was clear a captive is a tax evasion scheme. Full stop. That was clear to them, and so I can fully understand that. Quite some years ago, a lot of boards had or received that same feedback and said, hey, we don't want to go there, because also at that point in time, a lot of the captives were offshore. And now you see in the last years, a lot of captives coming from offshore to onshore. Also the view of OECD has a bit changed on the whole thing. So we've tried to inform them I wouldn't use the word educate, but we try to inform them on what the captive is really, and that is for a risk management, certainly in those challenging times on the traditional market, it's one of the tools of your risk management. It's not something you really want or need. It's something, a tool that you can have to manage your risk, and taking that into account, I think also to stay clear of all tax issues and difficulties. One thing you should take into account is to limit or avoid, or limit if you do it, to give internal loans from the captive to back to your organization, because that is something that the tax authorities really don't like. So we've seen in the past that captives were quite easy in giving loans back to the into their organization, but I can tell you that's something, if you can limit it, please limit it, because that's something that the authorities like OCD really don't like, because then that would strengthen their point of being that a captive is a tax evasion scheme.
Okay, so perhaps then that leads us neatly on to another question that's come in, which is, you've been asked to elaborate on the preferred region. What's driving the choice to set up a captive in a certain jurisdiction? James, I don't know if you want to start off with that one, and then we'll ask our risk managers.
Well, the jurisdiction you choose, I suppose, it's a bit of a personal choice. I suppose it really comes down to the research you've done on the particular jurisdiction you're dealing with. I suppose a big thing is to look at the reputation of that jurisdiction from the point of view of the legislation they have in place from an insurance point of view. Also, the expertise that is there, and basically, does it give you access to other insurance products, like in reinsurance markets and things like that? It may be just as simple as, where would the risk manager like to play golf when he can after COVID is over? But from my point of view, it really comes down to what you put in your feasibility study about what you're trying to do, and you look at each of the jurisdictions from a qualitative point of view. Again, yeah, I've worked in Bermuda from the point of view of the insurance market there. When I worked in captive management, it was one of those markets where I suppose that you felt that, it was almost like a one-stop shopping when you went there. You had the ability to set up the captive. But again, as they've said, as Carl said in his previous point, sometimes there's a perception of jurisdictions, and that's really what it is. It's purely a perception, and that's what you have to get over from the point of view of that. I'd be very interested to hear what Carl and Adrian have to say on this, because ultimately that's when it comes down to the jurisdiction you choose, it's very much a personal choice, and it's done very much for the reasons that are unique to the situation.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Carl, do you want to pick
Indeed,
up on that?
it's a personal choice. Do you want to play golf or do you want to ski? So it depends from one person to another. No, I'm kidding. I think the local know-how is an important one. The reputation, of course, the convenience to travel to, because that might be a slight idea, but if you have your boards over there and you have to change planes 2-3 times to get there, it's not very convenient. So the how easy can I travel from where my office is to the captive location? That's something to take into account. The cost, I think there is quite sometimes a substantial difference in cost from one location to another, and also the language may be an issue. But we've seen, and also, I mean, if I would want to start up a captive in Belgium, it's not possible because the legislation isn't there. So that's also something you have to take into account in if you want to say, well, I want to start a captive there. Well, is there the legislation to start up a captive in that country? So, but it will depend from captive from company to company, and from where your headquarters are and the links that your headquarters have. Some companies said, well, we don't have an issue with offshore. Some company says, well, no way, we want to do anything offshore, and that's why we've seen over the last year a bulk of a large number of captives moving from offshore to onshore, and we will see in the future how that trend goes. But I don't know if Adri has something to add on that one.
What we discussed previously about tax and tax avoidance in the past. Just as offshore locations like Cayman and Bermuda are seen as tax areas and tax freedom areas, and that's not good for your discussion with your authorities. And that's the reason that I think, and my company also think, that the captive should be somewhere where also your business is. That may be Europe, that may be Luxembourg, doesn't have to be the same place. From London to Guernsey is not so far away, but Cayman and Bermuda are more a question mark. But European locations, Luxembourg, Malta, is for European countries very wise. That the US goes to Bermuda, that's just part of the game, that's their issue. But that's what I'm seeing, and don't go into too much offshore areas, because then you get questioned about your tax, and you don't want to focus on that.
Okay, thank you very
much. And there's some additional, when you are in Europe, and Europe you have freedom of service of tax. So double tax already paid in another area, you can change that in your own company wise. But that's the discussion with your tax department.
Absolutely. We've got just 8 minutes left. It's gone very fast, actually. We've got a few more questions coming in for the floor, which I know we will address in some of our later sessions. So we may not go into them in too much detail now, because we're running out of time. But one of the questions that I wanted to go back to, and Carl, you sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, but we're just really talking about which classes are more appropriate for a captive. Is it short-term risks rather than long tail? I mean, what's your sort of take on that?
Well, yeah, short terms are easier to manage, I think, than the long tail risks. But it's also the volume of the risk. I mean, a storm can hit your captive very badly in a short period of time. Same with cyber. You also have to see, I mean, you could say, well, yeah, okay, a storm can hit my captive, but I will only offer 1 million of coverage. So what is the added value of 1 million of storm coverage? That's also a question you may ask. So the classes are so different, but the thing, as I said in the very beginning, the contingent non-damage business interruption, that's for me a very important one to work on, and that's something we should do. I think there are talks going on with a number of insurers in that field, because that's also something I think insurers do like if your captive is involved, because that gives them, I think, but James could contradict or confirm that. I think it gives a better feel to a traditional insurer, that if your captive is involved, then the risk management, that the risk manager is more up to date, and that you're really on the ball and following things closely, and that sometimes a traditional insurer will give you coverage or more coverage if the captive is involved than if the captive is not involved. So but the lines of business, I think it's captives can be theoretically as creative as possible. A lot of insurers are in the traditional boxes and silos, but that's one of the things where captives are and should be, and I think certainly should remain. That is in trying to elaborate more coverages that are not existing in the market, and it's a difficult battle, because also there, and maybe you said that here he goes again, but OECD once said, well, why would you give a certain type of coverage if not available on the market? Well, that's exactly why a captive is there, to give coverages that you cannot always find on the market. But I think the point of giving more ease to a fronting insurer or a traditional insurer involved in your program when the captive is there, and again, James, please confirm or contradict, I think that's an important one.
James, over to you.
Well, from the point of view of when you look at a risk as a traditional insurer, having a captive involved, I think, does bring certain things to the table. First of all, I think there's a willingness to participate in the risk, that you feel that your procedures are strong enough and that your risk management culture is strong enough that you're willing to participate up to a level in those particular risks. Normally, as well, at the attritional layer, which is something which can be very attractive to the traditional markets, that the captive is taking probably what would be considered the deductible, or where the losses would primarily occur. The other thing too is it also shows that the company is willing to look at its risk appetite. It's also willing to look at basically its risk culture, because you often find having the captive involved improves the risk culture, because it incentivizes them to basically improve their procedures, their health and safety from that point of view, because ultimately they are taking part of that risk. So, you know, it does demonstrate on behalf of a company that has a captive that they have an appetite and are educated in the way that they want to basically make sure that their risk is mitigated as much as possible, because ultimately they're going to pay for it. And you know, and as you were asking an earlier question, the last thing you want is that your captive gets blown out of the water by a lot of claims very early on before it has a chance to basically get on its feet. So again, it doesn't hurt in any way when you go into the traditional markets to have a captive there, and especially from the point of view if you have a captive that's involved in a smaller line, it basically demonstrates that there's a risk culture there within the company. So yeah, definitely, it's not going to do any harm anyway.
Okay, thank you. We're down to our last 3 minutes, so I just wondered if I could give you all just 1 minute, just to sum up. Our session was titled "Why and Why Now?" In a sentence, no more than a minute. Why would you say now? James, do you want to start it off, and then I'll go to Carl, and then finish with Audrey?
Well, I think the slides at the start from Arju were very informative from the point of view of the fact that we're in a hardening market at the moment. And I think getting coverages that you want at the price you want is getting more and more tricky. So I think it's important for companies to look at their risk and see if there's an opportunity for them to participate in some way to gain the benefit of having a captive in place. Thank
you. Carl, a sentence from you?
Yes, well, for me, the sentence would be buying is selling. So if you have to buy insurance, you have to sell your risks, and it will be easier to sell your risk to an insurer if you have a captive involved, and if, as James stated, that make things easier for an insurer to accept. So with the hardening markets of these days, my buying is selling, and having the captive involved will make the selling maybe a little bit more easier.
Thank you. Audrey, final words to you.
I can add on those two guys. It's all about the hardening markets, and the insurers are playing us and moving us in a higher level of retentions, higher level of premium whatsoever. We don't like that. We want to kick off that bloody insurers and not taking just your risk at your retentions, but bring your tensions back into your captive and manage your risk by yourself, playing your retention on a global wise, and have more inside information about your risk management. The captive is a solution for the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all three of you. We are going to be hearing from AIG again on the PCCs. We're going to hear from Carl, and we're going to hear from Audrey. I know there were questions particularly around claims and around PCCs, and both those things are going to be addressed in separate sessions. So please do join those sessions. So all that's left for me to say is thank you all very much. A great start to the conference. I think it's shown there's a lot that we need to explore in the next 3 days. We will be moving on to a workshop session next, which will look into business interruption, as mentioned by Carl, extremely important. So we'll see you in 15 minutes to do that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.